Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome on this, what is rather a cold day. Thank you for joining us this Tuesday afternoon. This webinar is titled Strategies in Response to High Fertiliser Prices, Planning for 2022. It's a joint event between SAC Consulting and ADAS, and is funded by the Scottish Farm Advisory Service. I'll be chairing the event. My colleague Craig Bothwell is in the background pulling all the strings. This webinar is prioritising cereals and oilseeds. If we do have any forage inquiries, Craig will be the go-to man to deal with those. Alternatively, you can post your questions, and if we don't respond, we'll try and respond after the event. Joining us today and we're grateful to have on board, is Roger Sylvester-Bradley. Roger will be known to many of you, I'm sure. Roger is Head of Crop Performance with ADAS, and after a few slides from myself, Roger will give us a more in-depth look. The agenda's in front of you. We hope to be around 40 minutes or maybe a little more if we've got questions. After the brief introduction, I'll just touch on current prices in the marketplace at the moment, and look at the impact on crop gross margins. And then Roger will cover off his views on managing expensive nitrogen, and a brief view on how we can mitigate against manufactured end cost. Q&As will be at the end. If you do have a question during the presentation, encourage you to click on the Q&A tab, which should appear on your screen when you join the webinar. Craig will see your questions and then he'll pop those up to us as a prompt to respond. If you want to send something privately to Craig, you can do that in the chat box. We'll record this webinar, and it will be available if you want to view it or pick up on anything in the slides that you might have missed. It'll be available on the FAS website at a later date. So we have a large number of people in attendance, which is good, and we thought just to make the most of that, we'll insert 3 polls. We'll do a couple now, and then Roger's got one within his presentation, just to gauge, well, from both your perspective and our perspective, where we are in terms of, firstly, what percentage of your 2022 N requirement have you purchased to date? Could you please respond, and we'll put the results up shortly. None, 1 quarter, half, 3/4, or all. I'm not sure where the industry average lies, so it'll be interesting to see the results of that, and we can feed that back to you. Okay, there'll be another poll to follow, and Craig will insert that when we get a chance. Right, so I'm just going to touch on fertiliser prices historically. Can you? Oh, I've moved that. Great. Okay, I'll move that poll out of the way. So a couple of slides from me before we talk to Roger, and I thought it would be interesting just to look at how fertiliser prices have moved really over the last 18 months. And the 2 columns on the left-hand side, where it says summer 20 and summer 21, were the actual figures that I lifted from the SAC Farm Management Handbook, which I'm sure some of you will reference, but you'll see in the issue that's just been released, the summer 2021 figures, which we compiled sort of August, September time. We put in 340 for nitrogen and 495 for triple superphosphate and 420 for potash, and that lifted up from the previous edition back in the summer autumn of 2020 from 226 ammonium nitrate, 250 triple superphosphate, and 247 muriate of potash. And then the last column on the right is where we are now. And the 690 is a figure that both Roger will refer to in his slides, and so I've used a figure. It may be slightly less than that, it might be slightly more. And those indicative figures of 525 and 535 of where we are on TSB and MOP. So, a considerable lift over the last 18 months. But I think surprisingly, when you look at it in the context of gross margins and crop prices, you may be surprised that the impact isn't as great as one might have thought. So if we have a look at those, Craig, on the next slide, what I've done is for winter wheat, spring barley and oilseed rape, is just to look at the standard budget gross margin over the last 18 months. So in this example, I've taken winter wheat, and the first two columns on the left, again, are out of the data that's actually in the agricultural costings book for a winter wheat crop that has an average yield of 8 tonnes a hectare and gets an application of 200 kilograms of N. And back in 2020, when we were budgeting for the 21 harvest, we had grain in at 150 pounds a tonne and fertiliser at 202, and we were looking at a margin of 989. In the summer that's just gone, when we just released a new edition, we had grain in at 180, fertiliser in at 327, and we were looking at a budgeted gross margin for the 2022 harvest of 1142. Now, you may or may not realise 210 pounds a tonne for new crop, but let's assume we do. We've put that 690 pounds a tonne in on the fertiliser costings there, where it says 552. And you can see actually that we're making slightly more money potentially if we realise those grain prices than we were budgeting for 6 months ago, and certainly 20% more than we were budgeting for 12 months ago, 18 months ago. And therein perhaps lies the crux of the matter, is that that is full rate, no nitrogen cut back at 200 kgs of N. So there is a story there, which I'm sure Roger will allude to, that there is a scope to optimise on that gross margin even further. So if we go on to the next slide and look at spring barley, we've done the same exercise, and this is a feed barley at 130 kilos of N, and you may realise more than 180 pounds a tonne if you get it away from malting. But we've taken 5.5 tonnes a hectare, and you can see that the three budgeted gross margins were 613 for the 2021 harvest, and originally 707 for the 22 harvest, and latterly, with the increase in the uplift in price and the uplift in fert again, although we've seen 150 pounds on the fertiliser bill, we're seeing not dissimilar margin, and I think perhaps the question is slightly often more difficult to gauge, is how much do we cut back on spring barley compared to wheat, and I'm sure probably Roger will have a view on that. Lastly, oilseed rape, and we've applied 200 kilograms of N as per the costings at 4 tonnes a hectare, and I'm not sure where we'll be on rape for 22, but we've put in 540 pounds a tonne. And you can see that the gross margin actually is considerably better than the budget for 2021 harvest, and not dissimilar to where we were budgeting for 6 months ago. And it is just brings you back to this issue of actually look at the net margin it's the correlation between grain value and fertilizer input price. And then we can graphically illustrate this just to make it a bit more clearer, in so much as that the green bar chart there on the right is the corresponds to the column that was on the right in the charts. Perhaps we shouldn't be bemoaning too much in light of the potential uplift in gross margins per hectare compared to last year. The question is actually, how much more can we improve or lift the margin on that green column if we cut out the top tier of nitrogen that is now deemed to be not giving us a response in terms of increased grain value. So that's really just a summary as a background introduction to current costings. We have the opportunity to do another poll. If that's ready, Craig, do put it up. Or if you have the results from the previous poll, put those up. Okay, so fertilizer purchase. So 51% haven't purchased any fertilizer yet, and that's probably not unsurprising. 14% have purchased all, 3/4, 5%. 24% have purchased half. So there's still quite a big exposure to the market. We have a second poll question, if that's available to put up. And this one is, what price bracket do you expect your nitrogen spend per tonne to be for harvest 2022? Do you think it will be between 250 and 400, 400 to 550, 550 to 700, or more than 700 pounds a tonne? So if you could give that some thought, and I know, there's going to be cost for urea or ammonium nitrate, but we didn't want to make it too complicated. So if you feel either your urea purchase or ammonium nitrate purchase will fall in one of those bands, if you could put it in there. Okay, super. I'd like to just introduce Roger. Does that poll surprise you, Roger, only 50%? You're mute still, so you need to turn your mic on. Yes, sir.
Yes, thanks, Craig. Yes, it's worrying. It'd be good to ask, this current poll that you've got there, we need to presumably say ammonium nitrate or something, because here we go. Yeah.
I suppose whether it's a urea or ammonium nitrate, what's it going to be, another 50, 60, 70 pounds difference? So potentially it could fall in the same bracket.
Ammonium nitrate is 460 kilograms of nutrient per tonne, whereas, ammonium nitrate is 345, whereas you get 460 for urea.
Yeah.
So, but it looks like the prices are quite high that people are expecting to.
It could be that some people have purchased some of their fertilizer, and the average is they might have bought for $290 early on, and they're going to have to top up with some more expensive stuff, which will average now to sort of 4 to 550. But there's still a lot of exposure in the market, isn't there? Products that so over to you, Roger. Just to perhaps delve a bit deeper into how we deal with these and what is the potential impact of these high fertilizer prices and what we can do about it.
Yeah. So hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yes.
So, good afternoon, everybody, and good to be able to speak to you. And you must recognise that I have operated most of my career in England. I actually am planning to move home to Scotland fairly soon, but but it's going to be a whole new learning experience. The last time I lived in Scotland was when I was a student. So what I want to cover is the way nitrogen affects your crops, and then to think about what the higher value of the nitrogen that you have or haven't bought, actually what difference that makes to the management of each individual crop, and then at the end move towards thinking about general farm strategy and what the difference makes into the future. And it would be interesting to know when we get to the discussion what your views are about the higher prices being sustained into the future. But to begin at the beginning, obviously I'm a biologist, I'm a crop physiologist. I try to understand the way nutrients affect crops and how it affects their yields. But in the end, the decisions you make are economic decisions. So I'm going to try and deal with the economics, the sort of overlay of economics that there is over and above the biology. So, and it's important in these documents, I've got 3 of the many documents that deal with recommendations for nitrogen. So that there's the technical note 731 from SAC, but there's also the AHDB's RB209, and there's also, dear to my heart because I wrote it, back in the days of the HGCA, we produced a more detailed guidebook that deals entirely with nitrogen on winter wheat, and goes through all the sort of biological considerations as well as the economic ones. But the recommendations are all given from economic, on basis of economic calculations. And so we need to get to understand those calculations. What we've, I'm more and more trying to do my research with farmers rather than for farmers. So, and what we're learning more and more as we do that is that there's when we look at all the variation, and that's what scientists are really interested in, actually the largest part of the controllable variation is between farms. So there's a lot you can learn by talking to each other and understanding what the differences are between you. And you need to be making measurements on your own farm to discriminate your to recognize the difference, the way that you differ from other farms. And I'm going to come back to the sort of whole farm picture at the end. But to start with the biology, nitrogen is primarily used to form the marvelous photosynthetic enzyme that allows us to fix carbon dioxide using solar energy, and it's basically the root of all life. And that's the primary purpose. As we bred wheat to yield more and more and more, actually the quantity that gets moved into the grain tends to exceed the quantity that you need in the leaves. So high-yielding cereal crops need more nitrogen than the leaves, the grain needs more than the leaves did need. So we have to keep that nitrogen going into the crop. And the sort of break even between low yield and high yield I'm talking about is about 9 tons per hectare. So I'm assuming you're all growing nice high-yielding crops, so that your crop demand depends on the crop yield and the nitrogen concentration of that grain. And then there's some nitrogen that you get free. It's not necessarily free because it might be the fertilizer from last year left over, or it might be provided from organic manures or things like that. But also from your soil organic matter, a certain amount of nitrogen comes from the soil supply. And that is the most variable part of the whole calculations that we're going to have to do. So it's the most important thing to try and to understand. The recommendations generally try and understand it in relation to previous crop and soil type. But then there's a gap between the soil supply and the crop demand, which has to be met by applied nitrogen, either in the form of fertilizer or organic manures. And it's important to recognize that those fertilizers or manures are not used with 100%, almost never used with 100% efficiency. So we have to understand the inefficiencies of the products that we're applying and try to mitigate those. So if you're using urea, then a portion of that will be volatilized in sort of cold and wet conditions. Generally, it's a small proportion, but it can be up to 20% or more of the total nitrogen that you apply gets volatilized as ammonia into the atmosphere. But that's if you're not applying urea and you're using ammonium nitrate, you only get a very little bit of ammonia emitted, but the main inefficiency is through competition between your crop and the soil microbes. So about 30 or 40% of the fertilizer that you apply gets locked up by the microbiology in your soil and retained into the future. Whether it's lost by leaching or gets into the next crop is a moot point, but it doesn't get into this crop. And the proportion that gets locked up is very variable, but generally it's about 30 or 40%. So your fertilizer is about, on average, 60% efficient. So the sum that you need to do to work out what your fertilizer requirement is the crop demand minus the soil supply divided by the fertilizer efficiency, or recovery as we call it. So just for an example, if the crop needs 200 kilograms per hectare in the crop by the time it's formed its, say, 10 tons per hectare of yield, and the soil is providing 80 kilograms per hectare, which is a pretty average sort of quantity that a soil might provide, then you're needing to fertilize to provide that 120 kilograms difference. And if your fertilizer is working at 60% efficiency, then you need to apply 200 kilograms in order to get the 120 kilograms into the crop. Now, that's the biology. Now let's get to the economics. Basically, if you keep on applying nitrogen until the extra grain you get doesn't pay for the extra nitrogen, the last kilogram that you apply, and that's the right point to stop. So I just want to know now, as I move into the economics, how you think your crops respond to nitrogen. So Craig's going to put up a poll, I hope. And we're asking you whether you think that the sort of last 50 kilograms of what you apply gives back 0.3 of a ton, 0.5 of a ton, 1 ton, or 5 tons. So if you pull back by 50 kilograms from what you normally apply, assuming you normally apply the right amount, what do you think is the response? I don't know how long I have to wait for you all to vote. But my next slide has the answer on it in the form of a graph.
I'll just give it another 2 or 3 seconds, Roger. We're at 50% voted.
Okay.
Right, that'll do, Roger. Roger, I'll just stop it now.
Okay, well, here are the answers coming. So this graph that you can now see without any dots or lines on it is the graph I've been drawing for most of my adult life as we do hundreds of these experiments. So along the bottom, we've got increasing amounts of nitrogen, the nutrient, not the fertilizer, so the nutrient, the amounts applied in kilograms per hectare. And at the left-hand side, we have the increases in grain yield, which go from 4 tons up to 11 tons. And on the right-hand side, we have increases in grain protein. And what we see when we apply increasing amounts of fertilizer is a curve that starts, obviously, only being fed by the soil supply. So we measure the soil supply by knowing the yield and the nitrogen content of that yield with no fertilizer applied. And this may be, as I was saying before, about 80 kilograms per hectare, which would form about 5 tons of grain per hectare. But then as we move up to, say, 100 kilograms per hectare, we move from 5 tons to 9 tons. So you get a huge benefit from that first 100 kilograms. But then the second, if we say that the optimum level, and you'll see where the optimal level is in a minute, but if the optimum level is about 200 kilograms, then you're only getting about a ton per hectare or a bit more from that last 100 kilograms. And actually, if we look at the economic optimum at a break-even ratio, so that's the ratio, the number of kilograms of grain you need to pay for a kilogram of nitrogen. And in the Scottish recommendations, that's currently set at 3 to 1. In the AHDB RB209 recommendations, that's currently set at 5 to 1. And the price, the new prices that Mark introduced and spoke about before me really produce a ratio of something like 10 to 1. So the optima have changed from sort of with 3 to 1, it's about 220. With 5 to 1, it's about 200. And with 10 to 1, it's about 150. And the amount of grain that you lose, yield that you lose from adjusting from 5 to 1 down to 10 to 1, so putting 50 kilograms per hectare less, is only about 0.3 of a ton per hectare. So what were the results, Craig? So I hope that that's good news it looks like it's good news for over 70% of you. 28% of you thought it was 0.3 of a ton per hectare. So the majority of you thought it was bigger than it really is. And that really is, I could stop my talk now, because that's really the lesson from all these response curves that I've been looking at. That the last, the fine adjustments that we make to nitrogen applications are really don't have big consequences for yield. And in fact, I've had to take out some of the slides from our presentation just because to save time, but we've done hundreds of these experiments with farmers doing tramline trials. And what we find is that their yields vary from 6 tons way up to 16 tons per hectare. But for every one of those fields where they've tested different amounts, it makes very little difference. You don't get fields that are going from when you apply an extra 60 kilograms per hectare, getting an extra ton. It just doesn't happen. So the yields that you're getting are something to do with other than nitrogen. Obviously the first the first 100 kilograms is pretty darn essential, but it's the fine tuning above the 100 kilograms per hectare is not hugely influential on your yield. It affects your gross margin as well. Have a look at in a minute. But the second thing about this graph is it's got I've got the protein response. And what happens to protein as the response to yield flattens off, the protein response remains fairly steep. And that's actually very useful. You can keep monitoring your protein or your grain nitrogen levels to tell you whether you're getting your fertilizer strategy right or not. And if you're generally getting low levels compared to that particular variety from your local variety trials, say, then that means you're probably under fertilizing, and vice versa. So if you're getting high protein or high grain nitrogen levels in relation to the general norm for your part of the world, and I know levels are lower in Scotland than they are in England, but so I would suggest that you should be benchmarking yourselves against local farms. But if your levels are generally low, you're probably under fertilizing. So, and that's really useful. Now, the variation that we see in these response curves is absolutely enormous. So this is 50 different experiments that we did on winter wheat about 15 years ago. Yield levels haven't really changed overall in that time. And we, I'm sure if we did the same 50 experiments in the same 50 places, we get just as much variation. You can see we've got sites here which produce 13 tons without any nitrogen applied. So they didn't need any application of fertilizer at all. And that's generally what we see. We go out onto fields which we assume will respond to nitrogen, and we find that 10 or 15% of them just don't respond. So you need to recognize that could be happening on your farm. And so you need to be taking the measurements to try and to test whether that's true or not. So huge variation. And just to show you that it's actually the soil supply that's the main component of that variation, what we've done here is to represent the same responses, but just adding the nitrogen that we get from the soil to the nitrogen that we've applied, and it brings the graphs all sort of more together. Obviously, the yield variation at the right-hand side of the diagram is still pretty much the same, but very little of that yield variation is associated with levels of nitrogen applied. The optima generally are slightly higher for the higher yields, but it's not a huge adjustment. So I'm afraid that you have to factor in that you are going to be wrong. And this is actually, this graph is against me more than against you, because I've put my whole sort of life's work into trying to get the recommendations right. And I know that 50% of the time the recommendations are not right. This is the best we can do. So this is the recommendations from RB209, but informed by soil mineral nitrogen analysis, which is the best way we can assess soil nitrogen supply. And what this graph shows the differences between the actual optima and the predicted, what I've called best decisions, so the recommended optima. And the differences range from nearly 200 kilograms too much to 150 kilograms too little. That's the error that we have in our recommendations. Half of them are close to being right, so the losses, the economic losses, are not huge from getting from these small errors. It's the large errors that are important, and those are the ones that we have to try and monitor soil supply, recognize yield level, recognize grain concentrations, and try to work to get eliminate those ones. Right. So now this next graph really repeats the message that Mark gave you earlier, that you're actually still probably better off than you were a few years ago. So this is, they're not exactly the same values that Mark used, but if we take the average response curve that I showed you earlier in orange, and we now express it in terms of margin over nitrogen cost, then the margin over nitrogen cost is about £1,300 per hectare if the grain was valued at £150, and the ammonium nitrate £260, which gives us a break-even ratio of 5 to 1. So the right optimum then is about 200 kilograms per hectare. That's probably, I sort of think of that as about 2 years ago. Then about 1 year ago, the grain prices were they went up, but so did ammonium nitrate prices, but they were both sort of in sync. So the break-even ratio was still about 5 to 1, and the optimum amount to apply was about 200 kilograms per hectare. And now the fertilizer has doubled in price. So the quantity of nitrogen, the optimum amount of nitrogen, is 50 kilograms less. and the grain value is similar as it was, but that means that the return compared with where we were 2 years ago, the return is still sort of £300 per hectare better off. So it's not all bad news. Just an explanation of, again, just to make sure everybody's got it, how you calculate a break-even ratio. You need to consider not necessarily the price that you bought the fertilizer at, but the price that it's sort of replacement cost. That's the way we think it's probably best to think about your nitrogen. I mean, in the end, it's up to you whether you want to sort of discount any resale value that your fertilizer has. But and again, you've got to sort of take a view of what the value of the crop is going to be come harvest 2022. But then the break-even ratio is just the ratio of the two. So it's the nitrogen cost in pounds per kilogram, which is the fertilizer price divided by the fertilizer nutrient content, and then the grain value in pounds per kilogram. So that's in £200 per tonne, that's 20 pence per kilogram. And then you can because the response curves for cereals and oilseeds are different, and also I've seen Alex Sinclair. I had an interchange with him over the weekend, and he's thinking that the response curves for barley are different from wheat. I couldn't convince myself of that when I looked at the response curves for the HDB in the last few weeks. We did a report for them, which you can find on the HDB website. So I've been considering that cereals respond pretty much in the same way. So that just means the shape of the response is very similar for all cereals. And that, if we start at 5 to 1, that means that by the time you get to 10 to 1, you're reducing by 50 kilograms per hectare. But this graph allows you to see how to make adjustments for all different break-even ratios. And you can see that because the oilseed response curve is actually flatter than the cereal response curve, then you need to make bigger adjustments for oilseeds than you do for cereals. So oilseed starts at 2.5 to 1, and if you double the price of fertilizer, it brings the oilseed break-even ratio to 5 to 1. So the adjustment for oilseeds, assuming that I know the oilseed price has increased, but if you ignore that for the time being, then the adjustment for oilseeds should be nearly 70 kilograms per hectare. But because the oilseed price has gone up, then actually it's the round figure for both oilseeds and cereals adjustment this year is 50 kilograms per hectare less than assuming you were fertilizing economically last year than you did last year. We've produced this. This is another way of producing the same information. So we've just done a report for the HDB, as I said, and this table is in the report that is on the HDB website. The HDB has also produced a calculator from this table so that you can work out what the reduction should be, and there's separate calculations for oilseeds and for cereals. So I hope that that's given you a sort of reasonable picture of the sort of economic calculations, and now I want to sort of move on to the implications of that. So the first implication is that any errors that you make now are going to be more expensive than the errors you made last year. So, and you will make errors. So it puts greater value on monitoring your fields, your soil nitrogen levels, your productivity levels, and you need to put greater effort into trying to improve the efficiency of your manures and your fertilizers. That's all becomes, everything comes into sharper focus. So you need to know your organic matter levels, ideally your soil mineral N levels, and you can actually get estimates now of your mineralization capacity of your organic matter. Clearly, yield levels are important. Any instances of lodging or very different behavior of your crops in the field, you need to register that. I'm a great advocate for the value of monitoring the nutrients that you harvest. You spend so much money on fertilizers, and I cannot understand why generally across the world nobody actually monitors the nutrients that they harvest. And you can do that very simply by just analyzing the grain field by field rather than, from the whole heap in the shed or in the silo. If you monitor field by field, you can then use grain. And incidentally, if you didn't know, protein is just grain nitrogen multiplied by 5.7. So you can work out from your protein by dividing by 5.7 what your grain nitrogen is. You multiply the grain nitrogen by the yield, and it gives you the kilograms per hectare you're taking off. And then you can relate that to what you've applied and get some feel for the efficiency of your whole system. And of course, there's in-season monitoring. There's all sorts of high sophisticated technology to help you monitor canopy size, which is, as I've already mentioned, very important. I like this. This is a little color chart they use in Asia for managing both wheat and rice. And it sort of gauges the color of your leaves. I think we should be doing more like this. And I'm sure you do it with your eyes, but it's difficult to sort of tell anybody else what color your leaves are. But this color chart allows you to put a score on the color of your leaves. And that's important information. If you've got dark green leaves, clearly you've got a better soil, the better supplied crop than if you've got light green leaves. And I'm also a great believer in experimentation. We do lots of tramline trials with farmers now, and they're learning a lot about the efficacy of the different practices and the different products that they're using from doing those experiments. So now if I move more to how am I doing for time, Mark?
Let's close on the hour. So sort of 8 minutes and 10 minutes for questions. Would that be all right?
Yeah. So if we now just sort of think a bit about farm strategy as a whole and how you can move to reduce the nitrogen costs for your farm. So I've really been emphasizing this already, that lots of monitoring, lots of measurement, those all become more valuable things to do as the price of fertilizer goes up. You need to think about reducing nitrogen losses from the farm. Basically, nitrogen, doesn't come and go by magic. There's a sort of mass balance of nitrogen on the farm. And the more you can do to keep nitrogen on the farm and avoid unintended losses, then the less you'll have to put nitrogen into the farm from elsewhere. So you need to treat and store your manures carefully. That's a whole subject that really we haven't got time to discuss today, but growing cover crops, something that people are doing a lot more nowadays, that keeps nitrogen in the system, stops it leaching over winter. If you avoid untimely cultivations, if you're using reduced tillage or even direct drilling, then that reduces the amount of autumn mineralization, and it's generally autumn bare soils which are leached over winter. That's all nitrogen that you're going to have to pay for in the future. Choose efficient fertilizers. I've got a couple of slides on that in a minute. And use efficient methods of application, and I'm going to mention that in a minute. But also, you can, this is much more strategic, but if you look at your whole farm system, then the more you can recycle nitrogen within the farm and not export it all in the grain that you sell, then actually that's good for your fertilizer bill. So integrated crop and livestock management is clearly a way of saving on fertilizer. recycling your manure nitrogen, and you can actually choose crops that need less nitrogen. So, well, the example we always use is that feed wheat can actually be replaced by triticale, and triticale it generally yields as well, it feeds as well, and it needs less nitrogen than wheat. So, but there are all sorts of other options in terms of crops that don't need a lot of fertilizer. But just to come back to the point of muck, as Mark's figures showed earlier, it's not just nitrogen that's increased in price, but P and K. And so the cattle FYM or pig slurry are almost worth double what they used to be worth. So again, their management is supremely important. An example of how to improve the efficiency of spreading of slurries is that you can use band spreading. It allows you to spread on crops in the spring, and it reduces not only the complaints about odor and so on, but it reduces ammonia losses, and it increases the quantity that the crop can get a hold of. We're just doing a review for DEFRA. We haven't finished it yet, but I just want to sort of mention that there's a whole range of nitrogen efficiency products that are out there, particularly nitrification inhibitors, urease inhibitors, combinations of the two, and some slow release products. I'm not going to go through all these in detail. I just wanted to point out that we've been doing some work with BASF, who've got a new, well, not terribly new now, but urease inhibitor. Urease inhibitors are actually, in the grand scheme of things, we lose more nitrogen in the form of ammonia than we lose as nitrous oxide and dinitrogen into the atmosphere. So the urease inhibitors, obviously they're only relevant for urea and in some cases for slurries, but urease inhibitors do more for nitrogen efficiency than nitrification inhibitors. Nitrification inhibitors I'll come to in a minute, but these are tramline trials dotted all over the UK, done for BASF with their product Limus, and they show on average this is the yield benefit over the untreated with Limus, and this is with Limus applied to urea, and this is with Limus applied to ammonium nitrate. So it's worth using with urea, but not worth using with ammonium nitrate. If we move to nitrification inhibitors, nitrification results in the emission of nitrous oxides, nitrogen oxides, and particularly nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, 300 times more global warming than carbon dioxide. So it's a very important greenhouse gas. We don't actually lose a lot of our fertilizer as nitrous oxide. These emissions here, look, are 1, 2, or 3 kilograms per hectare, up to sort of nearly 4 kilograms per hectare. So it's not huge quantities, but the inhibitors are very effective. On average, 44% reduction in emissions of nitrous oxide using these inhibitors. So, and there's several of them. So they're worth doing for sort of more really for climate change mitigation than for nitrogen efficiency. So I'm now going to try and finish, Mark. I hope that's not gone too long, but I mean, this graph is just reiterating the point that I said earlier, that nitrogen doesn't really cause high yields. So these are all our yields from the yield enhancement network. So they range between 7 tons to 17 tons per hectare. Their average is about 11 tons per hectare. There's a very vague positive trend in there. It's not like the high yields are dependent on vast quantities of nitrogen. So don't be afraid to cut nitrogen rates back. Nitrogen is a way of supporting yield, not really building yield, tons and tons of yield. Recognize that your farm may be different, so monitoring is important. Benchmarking your farm against other farms is important. High prices make your errors more expensive, so it's worth putting the effort into trying to avoid the errors, using grain analysis, considering some tramline testing even maybe. This is the question I was sort of prompted at the beginning. Clearly, the nitrogen has all sorts of costs over and above its economic costs to us in the farming community. So the environmental costs are very big and becoming more and more prominent in everybody's minds. And we need to take a view, I think, on how we manage nitrogen into the future, given those costs. And even if the prices come back down again next year, I would actually predict that they will when the energy supplies sort themselves out. But we still have to have in mind that nitrogen does have significant costs to it. So thank you very much. And just a quick mention of all our yens, which are there to sort of help you and interest you, and I'm trying to sell monitoring and knowledge of information about crops, and that's what they're all about. So thank you very much.
That's super, Roger. Thank you. Great to have a scientific mind applied to the discussion. There's one take-home message for me, which I'll end on, which I sort of picked up in your talk, which is great, and I'll share that. There are a few comments on Q&A, which we'll just run through. I've got 3 here. So the first question was, is it worth considering delaying winter ploughing in order to avoid winter leaching losses of nutrients? I suppose I've got an opinion on that. What about you, Roger?
Well,
is it worth considering delaying winter ploughing in order to avoid winter leaching losses of nutrients?
I can imagine delaying winter ploughing would have lots of knock-on risks and consequences that I would be very nervous about. But
I suppose it depends on soil type.
Yeah. So heavy land, the risks would be higher, I guess. But I mean, it will definitely help you retain nitrogen in the system.
And a pointer perhaps too, that cover cropping, if you get the chance on land that's going to be sat there before spring cropping's due on, could potentially retain 30-40 kgs of N that might be lost. So that's a sort of mitigation which some people are adopting already. This one I like. Are margins better if you put on 50 kgs too much or if you put on 50 kgs too little? Depends on a lot of things.
Well, assuming you know what the right number is, which we never do, that the answer is you're better off putting on 50 kilograms too much, but only very slightly. And I mean, I've studied this a lot, looking at those errors and how, what you should be doing with your strategy, given that we're likely to be making errors. And the answer was, well, I did the sums, and they're not going to be different now, really. I did them about 12 years ago, 2009, when the prices were going up. And the answer was you should apply about 10 or 11 kilograms more than the perfect optimum, if you know what the perfect optimum is.
So I read that an economic optimum is great on paper, but the risk and uncertainty means you want some sort of margin in there. I mean, it's it alludes, when I was talking about those bar charts, and is there anything we can do to increase margin, what we're saying is actually that your 0.3 ton response from that last 50 kgs of N, actually at the cost of £6.90 a ton and at the cost of £210 a ton, if you'll increase that margin on those charts by another £37 a hectare because that last 50 kg at those prices isn't showing a response. That's what we're saying.
Well, I haven't done the sum.
I've just done it.
You've just done the sum. As long as you multiply 0.3 by 200, so well, 0.3 by 200, which gives you 0.6.
Yeah.
Sorry, so it gives you 63 pounds.
63 pounds, yeah.
63 pounds, and then you took off
50 kgs. 50 kgs at 690 a ton is £100 a hectare. Take off your 63, leaves you 37. So on paper, you can make even more money. There's one more question here. Craig, could I bring you in on this one, on the available nutrient management tools that we can recommend, perhaps other than Planet? I know we use Planet in-house quite a bit. Do you have a comment on that, Craig?
Yeah, definitely. Let me put my camera on. The difficult thing with this is that the Planet is one of the only softwares that support Scottish MVZ rules, because obviously between a lot of the English systems, Roger, I'm not too sure, well, you guys use Planet as well, but obviously we'll have the likes of Greenlight Grower and Muddy Boots, and the new alternative is that they're all using RB209 recommendations from MVZ. So I have no personal experience of using the others, but I know Planet's fantastic when it can be used, and when you know how to use it, but I do appreciate that it's not the most easiest of things to navigate your way through. But a note on that is there is the Planet helpline is supported by the Farm Advisory Service, so if you do want a wee bit of help on it, myself and the rest of the Planet Advisory team are available through the Farm Advisory Service helpline number. So yeah, by all means, pick up the phone and see if there's anything we can help you guys with.
Okay.
Roger, do you use any other ones, Roger? Or?
Sorry,
do you use any
I've not really got anything to add there, Craig. Yeah.
There was a note that actually, if you are cutting back on N, probably avoid putting on once you're getting into stem extension, sort of growth stage 32, because the yield contribution drops off. Other than milling wheats, what do we do on the milling wheat scenario for protein? That we don't grow a lot of bread making wheat up here, but you're usually putting on sort of 40 kgs on the leaf, aren't you, in that scenario on flag leaf?
Yeah, not everybody does. I mean, and again, this is something that, I mean, farms have come to recognize that they're either good or bad at producing high protein grain. I actually think that means that they either generally over fertilize or they generally under fertilize. So, yeah, they think of it in another way. I mean, we're going to have to accept that 50 kilograms, if we reduce nitrogen by 50 kilograms on milling wheat before we add any extra, and the baking industry insists on having 13%, then we're going to have to, I mean, they're going to have to pay for it. And if we're going to have to try and meet 13%, we're going to have to apply a lot more than we are at the moment.
Yeah,
but it's not just, you have to justify it on the basis of the premium you expect and your chances of getting that premium, and it may not be worth growing milling wheat.
I know we said we had a sort of arable bias on here, but in terms of silage grass response, Craig, you sort of raised the other day that actually what's in the pit is what you've got, and can you afford to actually cut back at all, given that if you haven't got the silage in the pit, you've got to buy something else in? What's the feeling on forage?
It's quite a difficult one in that I suppose it will always be a bit of a case of the more nitrogen you go, the more grass you're going to grow. But I suppose it's the wider situation in terms of, as you said, Roger, earlier, increasing that nitrogen efficiency. And this is probably going to be the year that if you do need to cut back on fertiliser, then why not have a look at pH? Why not get the rest of things right and actually value the amount, or make sure you are valuing the amount that's coming for your muck and slurries and stuff. So there was a comment there earlier about maybe producing a webinar on grassland fertiliser, and the same as what we've done today. So we'll maybe go away and have a wee look at that. So
okay,
yeah, it's a bit of a bigger topic.
Well, we're up on the hour. I think it's probably a good place to draw things to a close. Thank you very much, Roger, for giving of your time. It's much appreciated. Take-home messages, I think we've really sort of covered them off. We've got an idea as to what that last 50 kgs gives us back. Errors are more expensive in these scenarios. And that 50 kgs actually contributes less than we anticipated as a group. And of course, it does raise a question whether we should be looking at future grain markets, and locking into those prices that are there is a way of sort of underwriting what we're potentially going to be paying for our fertiliser to keep those margins up. Questions we've dealt with. I think there is, Craig, do you just want to run through the response?
Thank you, Mark. As always, this meeting's been funded by the Scottish Farm Advisory Service, and in order for us to deliver that, they love to see the feedback. So there will be an email sent out either within the next 24 hours asking for your feedback. So it'll be much appreciated if you can fill that in. And there is a prize draw for £50 for either the Battlefield Bakery or Damn Delicious. So you'll win a raffle to win that for the month. So that gets given away every month. So by all means, please answer the feedback forms because they're very important. The other thing I was just going to say was on the 16th of December, we've got another webinar coming up looking at infrastructures and farm buildings and whatnot. But the reason I was mentioning this webinar was about the CPA is going to be in attendance at that as well, just to talk about the new restrictions that are going to be coming in over the next 5 years in terms of spreading slurry and slurry storage and whatnot. So all very pertinent with what we've talked about today in terms of maximising nitrogen efficiency. So yeah, without further ado, thank you, Mark, for chairing, and thank you very much, Roger, for speaking today. It's been fantastic, and hopefully there's been some great take-home messages from today, and people can have a think about what they're going to do going forward.